This is Michael Tierra, and I'm here interviewing my good friend and colleague and esteemed herbalist, David Winston, who is a herbalist extraordinary. He's one of the most welcome guests all over the world. He's an herbalist, ethnobotanist, 53 years of training in Chinese, Western, and eclectic and southeastern herbal traditions. In that respect, his background is not all that dissimilar to mine, forming planetary herbology and integrating Western and Eastern herbal traditions, including Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and Western herbal medicine. He's also, let me see, I'm looking at your biography. He's 46 years of experience. We're just about even, I think. When I started, I thought that I was basically the first clinical herbalist. And I made a big deal out of promoting that about myself and actually being that. Of course, Jeannie Rose was doing some stuff in San Francisco before, but mostly as a consultant. And then I met you at Brighton Bush in 1984. And this was a fortuitous meeting, a great friend and a great colleague, and somebody who I just immediately fell in love with. And for your wisdom and your knowledge and our backgrounds were enough alike that I felt kinship. And that's continued over the years. So David has excelled in several different areas of herbal medicine. And specifically today, we're going to talk about adaptogens. And adaptogens are, in my opinion, somewhat of a confusing term. And I'm going to leave it over to David to kind of like, what is an adaptogen, David? He wrote a book called Adaptogens, by the way.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I must say that the feelings are mutual. I actually think we met at Brighton Bush in 1981, not 84.
Well, that's the picture I got of us.
Yeah, that picture's in 84, but I actually think we met in 81, which was the first Brighton Bush. And I believe you were there. I know I was there. And as you say, it was a fortuitous meeting because for a long time, I thought I was the only herbalist first on the East Coast, for sure. And it's not true, I wasn't. But people were so siloed that, you just felt incredibly isolated and alone. And that first meeting at Brighton Bush, where we were sitting in that large building, the large room, and there were 70 of us sitting in this large oblong circle on the floor. And I just remember sitting there going, oh my God, these are my people. And it was such an incredible experience. And you were one of the people that I met then that it just blew me away that there was someone else who was equally interested in trying to create a synthesis of world traditions. Again, not just being siloed in one, and not to say that TCM, for instance, is not phenomenal. I love TCM, and it is amazing. I'm less knowledgeable about Ayurveda, although I'm very familiar with the herbs, less familiar with the tradition. I'm not formally trained in Ayurveda at all, but recognizing that there were a lot of similarities. Yes, there are absolutely differences, without a doubt. But the idea of, the thing that amazed me, and of course, one of my early teachers was the brilliant herbalist William Lassassier, was this idea of energetics. And of course, whether we're talking about TCM or Ayurveda or Unani Tib or Campo or Jammu, et cetera, or even physiomedicalism, there is this underlying concept of energetics. And at the time that we met, energetics wasn't really part of the conversation unless you were a TCM herbalist. Everybody else was, this herb's good for this disease. And while the allopathic use of herbs can be effective at times, it is far from the most effective you can be as an herbalist. And so Hippocrates said more than 2,000 years ago, it's more important to know the person that has the disease than the disease the person has. He was right. He's still right. And so energetics, understanding the energetics of the herbs and the energetics of the person is how you match the herbs to the specifics of the person rather than to, we hear about herbs, and we'll get to adaptogens in just a minute, but we hear about herbs like St. John's wort's the depression herb, or saw palmetto's the prostate herb, or black cohosh is the menopause herb. And there's only one problem with each of those things I just said. They're wrong, wrong, and wrong. St. John's wort, I think, is effective for maybe 3 of the more than 14 types of depression. Black cohosh, most women who take it will be underwhelmed by the effects, because when you treat a dis-ease, you are kind of dealing with something like, well, in general, it's going to have some benefit. Okay, so black cohosh in general can have some benefit. Right. But if you're dealing with a specific person who has, perimenopausal symptomology, the more you can treat that person, the more effective you're going to be. So, for me, it was meeting someone like you who also had similar thoughts and ideas, that it just was like, oh my God, I'm not the only person that thinks that this is possible. And I remember some of those early conversations that you and I had, and occasionally other people joining us, that were just brilliant, wonderful explorations of, what if, and what if we did this, and what herbs are incredible special medicines that you've stumbled on that no one else knows about. Anyway, I again, and so here we've had this long relationship as friends, as colleagues, and it has.
I often wish that you lived closer. We could hang out a lot more together.
Oh yeah,
it would be a delight.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. It's like on Herbal Hall, there's conversations going on all the time, and I rarely participate. One, because I'm dyslexic and I'm a terrible typist. It takes me forever to type anything.
Me too. I'm not dyslexic, but typing is a challenge these days as I get older.
Yeah, but one of the things is just that there are brilliant conversations still to be had, because one of the things I tell people is, as you mentioned before, I've been studying herbal medicine, and for 53 years. I've been in practice for 45. And after all that time, I kid, but I'm not entirely kidding when I tell people I now feel comfortable calling myself an advanced beginner, because no matter how much anyone knows,
I feel the same way.
It is a fraction of what there
People
is.
Say, "Oh, are you a master?" I said, "I haven't met any masters yet."
I agree, absolutely. So, getting to your question about adaptogens, I started studying herbal medicine in 1969, and I always kid. I tell everybody, all my friends
we're about on par with that. I think I was in 1968 at Black Bear Commune, and then I started wandering around the woods and wanting to learn about the plants that were in the mountains there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, I always kid. I tell people, all my friends are interested in one herb, and I was interested in all the other ones. Funny thing is, of course, that one herb today is more popular than ever. Still, it's still not my focus. But adaptogens, the first quote unquote adaptogen that I was introduced to.
Well, some people would even make that one herb an adaptogen today, which is crazy.
But it's not.
Of course.
So here's the deal on adaptogens.
We're talking about cannabis, of course.
Of course. Here's the deal on adaptogens. The term does not come from TCM. The term does not come from Ayurveda. The term comes from Soviet science. And the Soviets, starting in 1947 with Professor Lazarev, were looking for substances, originally not herbs at all. Originally, they were pharmaceuticals that could make better soldiers, better workers, better cosmonauts, so they could do what Khrushchev said, and that was to bury the West. They really wanted to create the sort of superior person who would be more resistant to illness and various types of stress, physical, psychological, etc.
Did they know Chinese medicine at the time?
No, not these researchers did not. That was not their thing at all. So they initially started, the first herb they started studying was Panax ginseng. Now, what most people don't realize is that even though the Soviets were a socialist republic and the Chinese were a socialist republic, so you would have thought they were friends, they were not. In fact, the two largest standing armies in the world were on each other's borders. And they were not growing Asian ginseng in the Soviet Union. And the last thing they wanted to do was have to pay hard-earned Western currency, because it was hard for them to get Western currency, and the Chinese wouldn't take rubles because they were worthless. And so the Chinese would only take dollars. The Soviets didn't have a lot, nor did they want to give them to the Chinese. And so they started searching for indigenous Soviet Russian plants that were, common and plentiful. And that's when they kind of stumbled on Eleutherococcus senticosus, which gets introduced into the United States as quote unquote Siberian ginseng. And I believe it was Ben Zarakor who actually coined that term, from Mali, basically as a marketing term. And now today, from a commerce perspective, it's illegal to call it Siberian ginseng.
Right.
And so it's Eleutherococcus senticosus. In China, it's still known as Acanthopanax senticosus, but only the Chinese botanists call it that. And so they started doing research, and the primary researcher is a man named Israel Breckman. And he starts this research in the 1950s. In 1961, he publishes sort of his first book on Eleutherococcus senticosus, and uses the term adaptogens, which actually had already been coined by Lazaroff earlier in the late 40s. And so this term does not exist prior to their introducing the term. Right. And so one of the things that a lot of people say, well, is I think an adaptogen is this, I think it's that. I don't have any thoughts about what I think an adaptogen is in that sense. I'm looking at the research. This is a term from science, so therefore, they have set the parameters for what it is. Now, initially, both Lazaroff and Breckman talk about adaptogens as substances that help us to respond more appropriately to stress. So they basically cause what's called a non-specific state of resistance. So it doesn't matter what the stressor is, psychological stress, temperature stress, physiological stress, regardless of the cause, it helps the organism to respond more effectively. In 1969, Dr. Breckman and Dardamoff proposed the first definition of an adaptogen, and there are three major points to this. Number one, it is non-toxic in normal therapeutic doses. Number two, it creates a non-specific state of resistance to stress. And number three, it has a systemic amphoteric effect, meaning it helps to balance out the system as a whole, not specific to any one organ. So that's the initial definition of an adaptogen, which is fine. The only problem is that many herbs could meet that definition that are not necessarily an adaptogen. Right. So one of the things is, of course, in science, it doesn't stand still. And over the intervening 50 plus years, there have been additions to that definition. In the 1990s, Dr. Panosian, who is probably the world's top researcher on adaptogens today, added that they discovered that the adaptogens work through one of two control systems in the body. They either work through the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or they work through the SAS, the sympathoadrenal system, which is your fight or flight mechanism, or both. So now the first three constructs of what is an adaptogen, those are still all true, but now in addition to that, the herb has to work through the HPA axis and or the SAS. And the HPA axis is the interface between the endocrine system, the nervous system, a great deal of immune function, the enteric brain in the gut, male and female reproductive system, etc.
That's practically everything, don't you think?
Well, it's a lot, but it is an actual system in the body that is actually functioning and coordinating activity between, the whole idea, and that's one of the beauties of TCM or Ayurveda or Unani Tib is the body it's not a separate thing. You can't just separate out one part of the body and think it is isolated from the rest.
The problem, of course, I think is that the assumption is that they didn't take into account properties, and as you and I know, all herbs have properties.
Correct.
And running around and calling something an adaptogen without taking into account the properties of the herb is a type of ignorance in herbal medicine, I think.
Well, understand that they're looking at it from a different perspective, and we'll get to
I'm
that.
talking about the general public now, and
Sure.
most herbalists practicing.
But even the researchers were not looking at that, because they're not coming from a TCM model or an Ayurveda model or any other traditional medicine model. So let me just finish the definition of adaptogens. So in around 2009 through 2011, the definition of adaptogens gets a further update. And this is again based on the work by Professor Dardimov, by Dr. Panosian and Dr. Wagner in Germany, who's one of I believe,
the echinacea man.
Yes, I believe he passed away, but I hopefully not, but I think I do recall reading that. Anyway, and what they discovered is, in addition to working through the HUA axis and SAS, adaptogens also are working on a cellular level. And what they are doing is they are upregulating stress compounds called molecular chaperones in the body. This includes 4 heat shock proteins, a forkhead protein known as FOXO, and neuropeptide Y. These are all compounds that are secreted by the body when you're under stress to basically help the body accommodate and adapt to stress. So adaptogens basically upregulate these molecular chaperones, and in doing so, they help prevent elevation of cortisol, which of course is a stress hormone, which has a wide range of negative effects on the body when you have elevated cortisol levels, and they help prevent cortisol-induced mitochondrial dysfunction, which is why adaptogens can be so effective as part of a protocol for things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome, which at their very base, at least in my opinion, are conditions that deal with HPA axis dysfunction and chronic sleep dysregulation. You have somebody who has chronic fatigue, and they may be in bed 12 hours a night, but their quality of sleep is terrible. If you can't get them to sleep well, you're never going to get them better. So anyway,
big point.
This is the definition of an adaptogen. So in order for an herb to be an adaptogen, it has to meet all of those parameters, which means of all the herbs that people think are adaptogens, there are only 8 or 9 that are what I would call, this is my terminology, a well-researched adaptogen. Then there are another 5 or 6 that I would call a probable adaptogen, meaning based on traditional usage and preliminary research, the evidence really points that they're adaptogens. Unfortunately, in many cases, there's just not a lot of human evidence. There's a lot of animal research maybe, but not as much human research to back it up like those first 8 or 9. And then there's an even larger group of what I would call possible adaptogens. And I will be very honest with you, I suspect the majority of them are not adaptogens at all, because the evidence for them, and this includes herbs like reishi, this includes herbs like maca, the evidence for them being adaptogens is incredibly poor. Now, that doesn't mean those are all the herbs. There are some other herbs, including a couple of fairly obscure herbs from around the world that I suspect are adaptogens as well. They're just not in commerce. Some of them are endangered or threatened species. So there's just not a lot of information about those. Right. And the other problem is that while the Soviet Union existed, they were the center for adaptogenic research. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, that research all stopped. So at this point, I would say, there's some adaptogen research going on in Japan. There's some in China. There's a fair amount in India, actually. There's some in Sweden, but that's mostly a specific company looking at a specific product. And there's some in South Korea. But beyond that, there's very little research being done anywhere else. And so there are lots of questions, as you have mentioned, about adaptogens, because there's probably a lot more to know about them, but there's just not as much research as I certainly would like. Right. So the reality is that people run around, you mentioned my book before. It's called Adaptogens, Herbs for Strength, Stamina, and Stress Relief, and the second edition came out in 2019. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book in the first place, the first edition was 2007, was I got tired of people calling herbs adaptogens that aren't adaptogens. And I wanted people to understand, first off, not everybody needs an adaptogen. You know, if you are basically healthy, you don't need an adaptogen. Adaptogens don't do very much in a healthy person. They're most effective in people who are deficient, depleted, etc. And under, you know,
You could say that with tonics in general, couldn't you?
well, that depends on what we mean by tonic. You know, if you're talking about like a quote unquote bitter tonic.
No, I'm not talking about bitter tonic for sure.
Right, but but the word tonic is pretty.
We're not even tropho restorative. It's a Chinese term idea of tonics. Basically four levels: yin, yang,
Yep.
qi, and blood. Yin
Right.
and yang, in my own surmising over the years, corresponds to the endocrine system, and which connects with your idea of the HPA axis, I think, very strongly. Go ahead and continue.
All right. So basically,
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, that's fine. So it's a conversation. It's beautiful. So, you know, the whole idea of adaptogens, what I did is in the second edition of my book, I created and I coined this term, and you know, somebody can argue with me about this term because I made it up, you know, but you know,
what term is that? Come on.
I call them restorative tonics. And it basically is
good. I like that.
Was a catch-all phrase for all these great herbs that people think are adaptogens, but just don't meet the definition, like astragalus and amla and goji berry, you know, gochitsu. These are great herbs, but they are definitely not adaptogens because
they're all in your book.
Yeah, they're all in the book, right, under restorative tonics.
You have them in there. I haven't read the book from cover to cover, but I glanced through it. Do you have them in there as adaptogens?
Oh, but that you're looking at the first edition of the book. That was 2007.
Oh.
Okay. The second edition, 2019, there was a ton of research done, again, around 2009 to 2011, that really clarified what is and is not an adaptogen. So herbs like astragalus, which I put in there as a possible adaptogen, I would now say absolutely is not.
Why would it not be?
Because it doesn't work through the HPA axis and or SAS. It has not been shown to upregulate those molecular chaperones. So if it doesn't do those things, it's not an adaptogen. And so, you know, the whole idea here is if I coin the term restorative tonic, I can then say what I think is and is not a restorative tonic.
Let me get clear what you mean by that. In what way I'm not that familiar with using those kinds of terms in my own clinical practice. Sure. So in terms of the HPA axis, I would think that that's endocrine driven.
It is. It is.
And astragalus certainly works through that.
Well, but it doesn't, there's no evidence. You know, astragalus works on multiple levels. It's a major cardiovascular herb. It works on immune function. It's a major kidney herb, but here we're talking more about kidney yin, not kidney yang.
Right.
It's a great herb. And so again, I consider it a restorative tonic. But again, if you look at the specific definition, does it upregulate fork head proteins? Does it upregulate heat shock proteins? Does it upregulate?
How does one experience an upregulated or downregulated proteins that you're mentioning? How do you actually experience it? Because I'm an herbalist. I go by what the symptoms are, what people actually experience.
Right. So I don't think there's any way for you to know that specifically, because you'd have to do blood work to be sure of that.
Well, then it may not exist.
Well, it definitely does exist because you can measure these things. But
then there has to be an effect. So I'm looking at the effect of those things.
Sure. So one of the effects is that it helps prevent, you know, elevation of cortisol.
Okay. So now I want you to clarify cortisol to me today. Cortisol is definitely a reaction, a hormone that's being secreted in reaction to stress.
Yes.
Stress, from a Chinese perspective, can be a yang phenomenon. And basically an excess of yang energy, of aggressive frustration, so forth. The reaction that I know with that, as I understand it, is a yin reaction. So is cortisol a yin reaction to stress? Does it have any? Does it have, is it? It's secreted by the adrenal cortex, I presume, which is why it's called that, and that's where the yin energy resides, as far as I'm concerned. So cortisol is considered a big bugaboo, but the fact of the matter is that most people who are under stress have low yin. Well, and it means that that cortical reaction, which may be the HPA axis, is overreacting to struggling to actually find a place to regulate things.
Right.
Am I wrong about that? That's
I don't think you're wrong about that. But you know, the reality is that Western science and TCM, there are places they overlap, and there are places that they just have a different view of the world. And I'm not sure, or at least let me restate that. I'm not sure that I could have a deep enough understanding to actually say, you know, you can say this is this and this is that, because in some places I think that they certainly overlap. But so let's talk about what happens when somebody has elevated cortisol levels.
Well, before you get on to that,
yes.
I want to comment that I'm known for doing a lot of saying a lot of really good things. I also know that I say a lot of things that aren't so good.
Okay.
But the point is that if we don't actually say something about what cortisol is or isn't, and define whether it's right or wrong, if it's not even a question of debate or consideration, we don't advance knowledge at all.
Right.
Knowledge is advanced as much by somebody saying the right thing as by saying the wrong thing. So I'll take the blame for all the wrong things I've said. that I think that ultimately it has advanced knowledge in certain areas of herbal medicine, and I think it's important. I couldn't have done it any other way. It's just me.
Sure. No, well, I agree with you, and that's why I'm saying before, it's like, for instance, I tend to be a little bit more cautious than you, I think, in the sense that if I don't know, I'll just say I don't know, and I tend to kind of reserve my opinion until I feel like I at least have some sense of you know, knowing about something. And that's just sort of, I guess, my personality. But what I would say about cortisol is we know that people have chronically elevated cortisols. And by the way, you can get to a point where you're so burnt out that your cortisol levels drop and now they're now too low. But most people, certainly in the early stages of
yin deficiency, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But in earlier stages of stress, chronic stress, what you see is immune suppression, inhibition of digestion, increased deposition of belly fat, obviously yin. All right. We see elevated blood sugar levels, and increased cortisol is not just associated with stress, but also obesity and metabolic syndrome.
Right.
And so we see a whole lot of processes that are incredibly unhealthy. And eventually can get to a point where your cortisol levels just literally drop off. And at this point, you are just so fatigued and so tired and so deficient. You know, that's where you start looking at people with, you know, chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome. These are people where the big event for the day is getting out of bed, going to the bathroom, and then getting back into bed. And they just, you know, they can't sleep because they don't even have the energy to sleep. They have what I would call deficiency insomnia.
You're right.
Those are the people you're giving things like red ginseng to.
Exactly, I've done that.
And they sleep great because for the first time, they have enough energy to actually get good quality sleep. You know, people think you just need to lay down, but you actually need a certain level of energy to sleep well. Right. So I think that, you know,
cortisol is really a great discussion in itself. I'm glad we've entered into it. I don't know that I want to move things along because I really enjoy the level where it's at right now. It's a level that I've always relished. I'd like to see what David Winston thinks about this one.
Well, I appreciate that. I do want to say one other thing, though, off topic of cortisol, and this is something you mentioned before about adaptogens. I had mentioned that I wrote the book on adaptogens, number one, because I was tired of people calling, you know, I mean, when I started seeing people saying cranberries were adaptogenic, I'm like, really? Come on, you know, that's ridiculous. But
Yeah, right.
the other reason I wrote the book is I wanted to give people a better sense of the personality of the individual plants. And when I say personality, I mean the energetics, the chemistry, the unique qualities of each plant. Because when I, certainly prior to COVID, I used to go and teach in the UK almost every year, either the UK or Ireland. And one of the things, especially in the UK, is for a long time, not so much now, but for a long time, it was like this idea of everybody should get an adaptogen, and the universal adaptogen is
Yeah.
eleuthero. And it was like nothing could be further than the truth. Each
Right.
of these plants has unique qualities. So there are stimulating adaptogens, there are calming adaptogens, there are moistening adaptogens, there are drying adaptogens, there are heating adaptogens, cooling adaptogens, nourishing adaptogens. They're not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. And so
Great.
you still have to look at the individual plant. And then there's whole groups of herbs I call companion plants for adaptogens, which are herbs that work really well with adaptogens, like our nervines, all right? Our gentle calming herbs, which work so well with adaptogens, or our nootropic herbs, our cerebral stimulants, which tend to work really well with adaptogens for some people, or the category that I mentioned before, the rejuvenative tonics. I often use them in the same formula as adaptogens. And then, you know, if you're talking about rejuvenative tonics, you could be talking about shu tonics, blood
Yeah, well,
tonics,
you're talking
yin
about the herbs
tonics,
that I use.
yang tonics, etc.
Exactly.
You know, chi tonics, all of those sorts of things,
As a matter
because
of fact,
they work so well.
I never use adaptogens as adaptogens. I've never used them in my practice. How about you?
Well, I use them all the time, but I don't think of them as just adaptogens, because I'm
Yeah,
looking at that
exactly.
as a whole herb. And so I never sit there and think, oh, I need an adaptogen per se. I'm thinking, okay, you know, if this person's really deficient and depleted, I need some herbs that are going to enhance the overall, you know, organ tone, et cetera, HPA axis, endocrine function, whether it's blood, kidney yang tonic, et
Right.
cetera. And so I'm looking at it from a bigger picture. So, you know, do I just say, oh, I need any adaptogen? No, I'm looking at the person. And when I'm creating a formula, I'm creating a formula that is specific to them as is humanly possible based on my knowledge or lack thereof. So I'm trying to create something. And if, you know, there's formulas that there are no quote unquote adaptogens in there, then there are formulas where there might be too, but I'm not just using them because they're an adaptogen, because these herbs have multiple properties that go beyond this idea of adaptogen. So
Exactly.
some of them, for instance, are immune amphoterics, but not all of them. Some of them, you know, also act as blood tonics. Some of them, you know, are moistening, so they are yin tonics. You're looking at the personality again. You're looking at the wholeness of that herb, and does this herb make sense for this specific person with their specific disease pattern?
The fact that you wrote a book on adaptogens and that being a very controversial property, I really appreciate that you did that. So anybody who's going to be watching this, if you want to know anything about adaptogens that has authority behind it, get David's book. But you did another book that I also think has controversy behind it, which is the term alterative. That's another discussion. And I like the fact that you're choosing those things that in my mind have problems in terms of the understanding of what they're doing and how they're used. So moving on, I'd like you to talk about some specific ones, starting with the classic, quote unquote classic Russian ones that came on. Eleuthero and rhodiola and marl. Is there a fourth one?
Yeah, there's several others, but a couple of them I actually have my own doubts as to whether they are really adaptogens, like the Aurelia manchurica, which is in the Russian pharmacopoeia as an adaptogen, but the evidence for it being an adaptogen is terrible. It's really poor.
It's easy to get sloppy with a word like adaptogen, I think.
It is, and I just will mention one of the things, I guess this is one of my pet peeves, is that you and I know how incredible herbal medicine is. And so, and most of the time we are talking to people who already believe that. But one of my goals, And this is, I did a keynote talk some years ago, and I called the keynote talk, I Have a Dream. And I started off by saying, look, I said, you've heard these words from somebody before, far more eloquent than I, but I have a dream too. When you and I started doing this, herbal medicine was so far out in the left field. It was literally in another field altogether. People would say to me, what are you doing? I'd say, I'm an herbalist. And they'd look at me like I just told them I was an alien who had come to abduct them. People were like, you mean like spices? And I'd go, no. And they go, if they're really smart, they go, you mean like potpourri? And I go, no, medicinal plants. And I could just see them shaking their head going, poor misguided youth. Why would you want to waste your time doing something people did 100 years ago? It would be like me telling them I was learning how to deliver ice for their ice box or light the gas lamps at night.
Right.
People couldn't understand why I was interested. And the reality is I fell in love with plants and this idea that I could walk out in the fields like you were in the woods and find medicine and find food. And it was just, to me, it was just the most incredible thing. So one of my first herb books, besides like Back to Eden, was, Yule Gibbons, Stalking the Wild Asparagus and Stalking the Healthful Herbs. Those were like two of my first books.
It was a good book at its time.
It truly was. So anyway, the idea for me is that I would like to see within my lifetime, and this might be a dream certainly bigger than me, but coming from a time where literally herbs were extinct. In 1969, if you and I went into your average pharmacy, there were maybe 3 herbal products in that whole pharmacy. There was some kind of distilled witch hazel, there was something with senna, and there was ipecac.
Right.
That was about it. Exactly. And so I think, as I said, you and I know, and many people know that herbs are not the end all and be all. There's lots of things that herbs can't touch. And that's why we have other, and I'm not opposed to Orthodox medicine. I think that, Western medicine, Orthodox medicine, and what quote unquote CAM medicine or herbal medicine, I think they actually work really well together.
Yep.
But what I would say is that we all know that the American medical system is unsustainable. We spend more money per capita than any other country in the world. Our outcomes are far worse than any other quote unquote first world country. We have higher infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy. We are a leader in obesity and cancer, but in all positive health measures, we lag far behind. And so I actually believe that well-practiced herbal medicine could be one thing, not the main thing, but a piece of creating a sustainable practice of medicine in this country.
I totally agree.
So if that's the case, my dream is that I'd like to see a time where almost every mom and dad and grandmother and grandfather knows basic kitchen herbal medicine for their families, where there are community herbalists in every community, and there are clinical herbalists available in almost any clinical setting, because I think it can make a difference. I mean, how many times do you see people getting unnecessary antibiotics for UTI when herbs would have worked perfectly well with virtually no negative sequelae? Yet those antibiotics, there are some significant issues with that, including obviously drug resistance, which is a huge problem. So that is my goal. So if that is my goal, one of the things that's important is if we are no longer talking to the choir, so to speak, the people who already believe, and now we're trying to talk and communicate with the medical community, with people who are kind of skeptical about herbal medicine, I think terminology is really important. And I think that within the herbal community, one of the challenges is there's a lot of sloppy terminology. And as I said, that's one of my pet peeves. So, what is an adaptogen? Well, I can tell you based on the research what it is and what it isn't. What is an alterative? Well, I have my own definition, but it's my definition, but it's based on, again, a lot of research, although not modern research, but just really delving back into the history, what actually constituted an alterative, what doesn't. Because if we can't even communicate among ourselves and have some consensus about what our terminology means, how are we going to communicate to people who are looking at us going, I'm not sure this stuff is legitimate, if we can, if we're getting 15 different definitions of an adaptogen.
Exactly.
22 definitions of an alternative. So that's one of my goals about trying to create a certain level of precise language and hopefully a certain level of consensus within the herbal community, because I think that it basically empowers us to take
Well,
this
I've
outside of our
been on the same track as you in that regard. I've been daring and going against the general will of both Chinese and Western herbalism in actually trying to find Western physiological equivalents to Chinese terms.
Mhm.
And again, maybe equating, well, when we used to talk about kidney energy in Chinese medicine, we know the organs in Chinese medicine aren't necessarily the same as the organs in physiology. But when we used to talk about that, I would describe the kidney energy as kidney adrenal.
Mhm.
Adrenal doesn't cover all the parameters of kidney of hormones for sure in the body, but it's enough to at least point people to the fact that the term yang energy, kidney yang energy, actually has a physiological basis. Right. And people can go look more deeply into what that might be in terms of all the different reactions in the body. Western medicine does divide things up between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, which is equivalent to yin and yang as far as I'm concerned. Right. So we found, Leslie and I both have found correlations with the organs in terms of spleen qi, and I used to call the spleen, I would say spleen pancreas, just to let people know that it was more than just the spleen. Right. And there would be some argument of corrupting the Chinese ideas, but I don't mind corrupting, because I think ultimately these things all need to be put into the wash, and come back out in some way that they can be integrated. So I'd like to talk about some specific herbs that maybe you use and I use, like for instance, starting with the Luthero. How would you use it, and what situations have you seen it, if any, that it has an effect?
Okay.
And what effect does it have?
I will just say one thing, Michael, before I get to that. I don't think what you're doing is corrupting in any way, shape, or form. As soon as you take Chinese medicine and can translate it to English, you're changing it. And right. There are some terms that, what I always tell my students is, I talk about in my Tierra Herb Studies program, we differentiate between the liver, the anatomical organ, and the right. Chinese liver.
Right.
They're two very different things. And so I appreciate that you say that and telling people that, because anytime you translate something, you're already changing it. And of course, TCM is phenomenal, but it's also, I don't believe in sacred cows. Everything is subject to change as we learn more.
Right.
So getting to Eleuthero, Eleuthero was probably the second adaptogen that I was introduced to. Again, at the time it was known as Siberian ginseng. And I already knew about Asian ginseng. I personally find Eleuthero to be a very mild, non-nourishing adaptogen. And so because of that, I primarily use Eleuthero for younger people who have all of their vital energy. So this isn't for the 45-year-old who started to notice signs of aging. This is for somebody 15 to 35 who is experiencing acute stress. It could be they're in college studying for finals and pulling all-nighters. It could be the young couple who's just had a baby and, they're not getting a lot of sleep. It could be that person who just graduated the bar and their new law firm expects them to work 65, 70 hours a week. And right. They need something to help support endocrine function through that process, but they basically have all their vital energy. They just don't want to let it get drained. And so I find Eleuthero most useful for those type of situations.
Perfect.
Rather than for somebody who is, you have somebody with chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome, Eleuthero is not going to cut it. It
No.
just isn't strong enough. And you had actually asked me about, there's a related herb, Acanthopanax graciostylis, which is known as wujapi. Eleuthero is siwuja.
Siwuja.
Siwuja. So the wujapi is Acanthopanax graciostylis, and I think of that as Eleuthero light. And so Eleuthero itself is very mild, and so do I use it a lot? I use it for young people who need some endocrine support. The one thing that the wujapi does better than the siwuja is that it's better for kind of like
arthritic conditions.
Yeah, exactly. So you have somebody with like bee pain, with sort of that kind of condition. It's actually better for that.
Right. And of course, the Chinese classify Eleuthero as a spleen, going to the spleen as a chi tonic, whereas Acanthopanax gracilistis is more for liver and kidney, which means it's affecting the joints and the circulations more.
Right.
But I in my own use of Eleuthero is when somebody is sort of run down and they have arthritic conditions. I'll prefer to, as a tonic, to include never by. I don't think it's strong enough to do anything by itself, but I'll include it as a mild tonic for those kinds of people. And I sometimes call Eleuthero arthritis ginseng, just as I don't want anybody to imitate that at all.
Yeah, there'll be a product out in the market next week.
Okay, well that's great. So we're on a par with that. Rhodiola is another one. That one really speaks to me. And interesting enough, I don't think the Russians have discovered very much in this relationship to women, and yet it seems to have a very specific, powerful effect on women and female hormones and so forth. So interesting in your thoughts on rhodiola.
I think rhodiola is the most stimulating of all the adaptogens. Now, the reality is red ginseng is actually slightly more stimulating, but red ginseng is also deeply nourishing. Rhodiola is not nourishing, in my opinion, at all.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Rhodiola is much more likely, if you give it to the wrong person. You have that person who, if they eat a little tiny bit of chocolate after lunch and they can't sleep at night, you give rhodiola to that person, they're up all night. So you have to be careful on that level. Very stimulating. It also is very drying. So anybody with yin deficiency, dry mouth, dry cough, dry skin, dry eyes, vaginal dryness, lack of synovial fluid in the joints, you want to be very careful about using rhodiola because it can really exacerbate those things. On the other hand, if you have somebody with dampness, so you have somebody with a tendency where loose stools, diarrhea, constant postnasal drip, things like that, rhodiola can be really useful. So I think of it as a very stimulating adaptogen. It also has nootropic effects. It enhances cerebral circulation. And of all of the adaptogens, the two that are the most profoundly what we'll call anti-inflammatory, you'll read that they have, they're antioxidants. Well, what we know is that most of what we call antioxidants, if you ask somebody, they'll say, well, what does an antioxidant do? Say, so they quench free radicals. It turns out that most things that we call antioxidants, while they do that, that's not predominantly what they're doing at all.
No,
what they're actually doing is they're upregulating basically a DNA compound called the antioxidant responsive element. And so what they're doing is
you have such a command of that whole genre of language. I don't.
That's okay.
That's because I talk from the Chinese level completely,
right.
and because I don't think you've made Chinese medicine your major function.
It's all in there.
You're relating it more. You're relating more to a Western.
A little bit.
But
especially
anyway,
when
I
it
think we're
comes
both saying the same thing, so that's all that matters.
absolutely. And I understand what you're saying, and hopefully I think you understand what I'm saying. So
I do.
anyway,
Well,
but what does that mean? It means that they act as systemic anti-inflammatories, reducing inflammation. And so rhodiola and schizandra, of all the quote unquote adaptogenic herbs, are the two that have the greatest anti-inflammatory activity. Those two.
rhodiola and which one?
And schizandra. Ooh, it's,
Zandra.
yeah. Those two have the greatest anti-inflammatory activity, and probably red ginseng's close in that.
More than turmeric.
I'd say they're probably close to turmeric.
I'm gonna make a note of that. I never thought of Schizandra in that way.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's hepatoprotective. That's why it protects your liver. It's basically inhibiting damage to the hepatocytes through anti-inflammatory activity. And that's why it's good for asthma, because it reduces respiratory inflammation.
See, that's
Besides that, helps the kidneys grasp the lung chi. So we can go for either side.
That's where you come up with things that I don't come up with. That's great.
Well, that's and you do this too, because I've seen you do it. That's one of the beauties of not having just one way of thinking about things.
Oh,
Of
absolutely.
looking at things in multiple. It's like having multiple tools, multiple sets of tools, and having
Right.
different colored glasses, so you see through different perspectives. Again, in my 2-year program, that's what I try to teach people, is that, not just one way of looking at things, but multiple ways of looking at things, so that you're not trapped in just one view of the world, or one view of the human body, or one view of disease.
Right.
Anyway, so rhodiola, as I was saying, has incredible cardiovascular activity. It basically is a cardiovascular tonic. As you mentioned, it enhances female reproductive function, but it also enhances male reproductive function. There are studies showing that it enhances erectile function in men, that it enhances fertility in women. It can also be used, because of its astringent quality, for women who have like non-specific vaginal discharge. It'll help with that. It would be one of those herbs in Chinese medicine. If it was used more, they probably used to astringe the jing.
Right.
Absolutely good herb for astringing the jing. And so I use rhodiola for a lot of those things. And so if you have somebody who is so depleted that they can't sleep, you could use rhodiola, but then you have to support it with a second herb that is more nourishing, because rhodiola doesn't have that deep nourishing quality that you see with some of the adaptogens. Not all adaptogens are deeply nourishing. That's why I said before, some are nourishing, some are not particularly nourishing. Some are more, think of them as being more stimulating. And this one is certainly one that is definitely more stimulating. I tend to use rhodiola for people who have, basically what I would call, for depression. And there is a specific type of depression, and again, I coined the term, I call stagnant depression. Stagnant depression is basically situational depression that becomes chronic. So think of it as a mild form of PTSD. Something happens in a person's life and they get stuck there. I'm sure you've had patients like this, where literally that event becomes the sun and they are now orbiting that. They don't have the strength to escape the gravitational pull of the trauma. That is stagnant depression. And I use rhodiola a lot for stagnant.
In the course of all this, I always think it's important to mention dosage.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't mention that in terms of Eleuthero nor rhodiola, but I tend to really go for high doses of things, because I'd rather see somebody have a bad reaction to an herb that tells me something than have no reaction at all. because as I understand it, most reactions to herbs are minor, and there are side effects. Some of the, but mostly they wear off within 24 hours or one or 2 days. So you just kind of like stop it and it goes away. Not so with Western drugs, which sneakily go in there and cause long-term damage, and you don't even know it's happening.
Right.
So I don't know what kind of dosage would you use? I mean, the first book I wrote, Way of Herbs, very successful book, by the way.
Great book also.
And I consider the most important thing in that book that was an innovation was I was the first one to actually say that you needed to use a handful of herbs to a pint of water,
Hmm.
which was, every book before that talked about teaspoons and things like
Right.
that. And so consequently, people were getting results from the stuff that I had in the book, which could have appeared in any other book, because a handful to a pint of water. The question of tinctures becomes an issue because there's the alcohol factor and things like that. I remember Subhuti Dharmananda saying that he could drink a whole 1 ounce bottle of tincture, and that might equate to a day's dose in Chinese medicine. So I don't know. When I think of Eleutherococcus, I think that most of the time is indicated and sold in very slight doses, so people wouldn't feel anything from it. How would you use it?
Well, again, obviously it depends on the herb, it depends on the dose form. So if we are using Eleuthero is available as a bulk herb. It's available as extract granules, which in my opinion is that those extract granules, you got to use very high doses to get activity from them. It's available as
the freeze-dried granules?
They're not freeze-dried. They're the TCM extract granules. They're
that's
not
what I'm talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah. They're
You have to use high
spray-dried.
doses of it. And that
You need really high doses.
really,
That's been my opinion. They
Wonder why.
used to, they're, excuse me.
I wonder why.
I just think that a lot of the, well, it depends on what brand you get, I guess, but a lot of them don't seem to be very strong. But there are a couple companies that seem to have better quality. It just depends on the quality of those extract granules. Some of them, there's a lot of carrier agent. In some cases, there's not. But anyway, there used to be a product from Russia, from Soviet Union, that was a Eleuthero solid extract. Or actually it was a fluid extract, but it was very, very thick and really strong. And you did not have to take massive doses of that stuff to notice an effect. But if you were talking about an Eleuthero tincture, you have to take considerable doses. If you're talking about Eleuthero as a decoction, and making it as an infusion isn't going to do much of anything, because it's basically you're grinding up wood here. Right. So you need to decoct it, and you need fairly high doses. And it also depends what you're mixing it with. How big a part of a formula is it? And so, yes, without a doubt, in TCM and Ayurveda, we tend to see much higher doses than we see from what most American herbalists are doing. And I will, this might be controversial, but I will say that I also see some American herbalists who are using doses that are so small,
right,
that I'm
I
like,
don't understand
when somebody says they use chickweed, 3 drops of chickweed tincture 3 times a day, I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. And to be honest with you, I have to say that, when I started hearing people talk about this, because this is not just an American phenomenon, there was an Australian herbalist, Dorothy Hall, who used tiny drop doses. So it's not just an American phenomenon, but I at times have tried experimenting with that. And I'm not talking about drop dose herbs like a phytolacca or a pulsatilla or an arnica or an aconite, which, drop doses are appropriate. And I've tried that. And with the exception of a very small number of people that I will call the deficient boulder vegan, those kind of drop doses, and what I'm talking about is people who are just oversensitive to everything. They get on an elevator where somebody was wearing too much perfume 2 days earlier, it just knocks them down. They'll come in your office and they'll tell you, oh, I tried this and I had a reaction. I tried that, I had a reaction. Doctor gave me this, I had a reaction. They'll tell you, if this happens, for those people who are really oversensitive, those kind of drop doses probably can be very useful.
That's a good point. Thank you.
That happened. But for the average person, when I've tried with patients and said to them, hey, look, you're interested in doing an experiment, and people say, sure, I'll try an experiment. When I've tried them with most patients, they don't work, those kind of doses. Now, for some people, they claim they do. I can't say that they're wrong. I have a saying, I don't argue with success. If it works for that person, great. But in practice, those kind of doses in general don't work for me. So My doses are probably in sort of in between, not your average American herbalist dose, but not quite TCM dose. I'm probably somewhere in the middle there. So toward the higher end, but
So how much tincture would Eleuthero would one need to
well,
take?
are you talking about taking it as a simple? Well, as a simple, you're probably at least 5 to 6 mils TID.
Okay.
Minimal, and that's
like a 1 to 2 teaspoons.
Yeah, something like that. But that's if you know, a fairly good 1 to 3, 1 to 4 tincture. If
Right.
if it's more dilute, then you're gonna have to go higher.
Now you have a company which people a lot of people here in the West don't know too much about. I wanted to mention Herbalists and Alchemists.
Mm-hmm.
And I've used your products, and they are of some of the best in the industry as far as I'm concerned.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, I never actually
and you know, it's backed by one of the best herbalists in the world, for one thing.
Wow, thank you.
But the other thing is that you have a history of actually going out and picking those herbs yourself.
Oh yeah.
So you know a lot about the growing conditions, and you can specify where you want them from. I don't think any other herb company in the country has that kind of meticulous sense of quality as Herbalists and Alchemists do. And at the end of this, I want to be sure that you mention how people can get in touch with your products, because I really think it's important.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate those kind words, Michael. Well, the reality is, as I said, I never wanted to have an herb company. I was a clinician. Right. And I simply couldn't get good products for my patients. And while today the company is much larger and most of the people who are getting them are not my patients, the same philosophy holds true. And you're right. Up until, oh my goodness, up until maybe, see, I moved 8 years. So up until 8 years ago, I was still wildcrafting for the company.
Right.
You know, up until 15 years ago, probably I still ran the labs. And made and still was involved with making the products.
Right.
And everybody, here's one of the other things, almost everybody at the herb company has been trained in my 2-year herb studies program as an herbalist.
Fantastic.
Including the management.
I like that.
Including the customer support people, because we want people to understand what this is about. It's about creating the best herbal medicine that we can possibly create.
And I think you come really close to it,
thank you.
to what that can be achieved. And I hope people check into your products.
Well, thank you.
Getting back to Eleuthero, my guess is I would take one of your 1 to 3 or whatever you're making your Eleuthero at, and I would say you need to take a tablespoon.
You certainly could do that. It just gets expensive.
And that's the problem.
But see here, there's one thing.
The other thing is how you deal with the alcohol. Now, some people think you can put it in boiling water and boil the alcohol off. Now, you and I have had discussions about that. And not all the alcohol goes away. So, how much does enough of it go away to make that big of a difference?
Actually, no.
Okay.
Here's the thing: if you drop it in hot water, that hydroalcoholic bond is very, very strong. You're losing probably less than 5% of that alcohol.
Wow.
If you boil it, if you boil it, then you're going to lose a lot more alcohol, but you're also likely to do damage to the herb, especially if there are any heat-sensitive constituents. So if you have something, now Eleuthero doesn't, but if you have something that has volatile compounds, you know, essential oils, things like that, you're going to destroy them by boiling.
Yeah.
So, but here's the other thing about alcohol. Alcohol has its pluses and minuses. Yes, we know alcohol in excess is not particularly good for you, but most people, and I'm sure you've seen something like this in your practice, I would say 60 to 65% of my patients have serious digestive issues.
Alcohol is good for that.
You know, so the reality is if you take herbs in a pill form, if you take them in a capsule form, you have to digest them. If you take it as a tincture, the alcohol
pre-digested.
Basically, what I tell people to do is put a little bit of water in your mouth, squirt the tincture into your mouth, swish it around your mouth a couple times, and swallow. Some of that, because of the alcohol, is absorbed sublingually and is in your bloodstream in seconds. The rest of it goes into your stomach and it bypasses digestion because of the alcohol carries it directly past the gastric mucosa into the bloodstream. And so
Exactly.
there is much greater bioavailability in tinctures. And that's one of the reasons, in my opinion, you need smaller doses in
I,
tincture.
I've come
Teas,
to
on
that
the other
conclusion as
hand,
well.
teas, on the other hand, while they are more available than, say, a capsule or a tablet, you still have to digest them. It's easier because it's in water, but the alcohol does something unique by literally bypassing the entire digestive system.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad we broached that subject, because I know that it's a burning issue, and the fact that we're getting into that might help people understand how to use herbs better. So I would now modify my dosage of Eleuthero to 1 teaspoon as a max. because tinctures have an advantage of being more digestible, so you don't need to use as much. You and I both came to that conclusion probably independently of each other, as many things we have in the past. So there's another one of the Russian ones which I have in my clinic, but I've never used it. It's the marrow root. Have you used it?
Yeah. It's also known as Lucia, marrow root, Raponticum.
Right.
There is a Chinese species of Raponticum that's used in Chinese medicine, but it's not the same species of Raponticum that's used in Russian medicine. It's related, but not the same. And by the way, I would also tell you that an awful lot of the rhodiola, which we were talking about before, a lot of the rhodiola in the marketplace is Chinese rhodiola, most of which is not Rhodiola rosea. It is other species of rhodiola, and they're not the same. The Rhodiola rosea contains not only salidrosides, which all the rhodiola species have, but it also contains a class of compounds called rosavins, which are highly active, that are not in any of the other species of rhodiola. Plus, it contains basically volatile oils, which give it that incredible rose root, rose geranium, which is not in any of the other rhodiola species. So
well,
just be aware there's a lot of rhodiola.
I'm busy jotting down notes as you talk. So one so quote unquote master herbalist taking notes from another master herbalist.
Believe me, Michael, I cannot tell you how many times I've sat in your classes and taken a whole lot of notes. It's always enlightening and a pleasure. So the Raponticum is the most anabolic of all the adaptogens. And so that means it builds muscle. So where I tend to use Raponticum is either people who are doing incredibly physically demanding labor, or they're like triathletes who are like, super training, or elderly people who are losing muscle mass.
Wow. Have you seen it be of value in those situations?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I don't give it as a simple. I don't give anything ever as a simple. I use, I always like, we use complex formulas because we're dealing with complex people with complex problems. But yes, I absolutely have. I would also point out there's an interesting, you have to take a lot of the old Soviet studies with like a huge meteorite of salt, because a lot of the quality is not good. But there's a very interesting study that was done on Raponticum for people who were, and it was given as a decoction for people who were going through alcohol withdrawal. And one of the major symptoms of alcohol withdrawal is severe depression. And they gave the people who were going through alcohol withdrawal Lucia or Raponticum decoction for a month. And something like 30 or 40% of the people had no depressive symptoms for the next 6 months, and then another percentage for a year, and another percentage for 18 months. All in all, it was and again, there was no follow-up studies, and one study is not proof, but still in all, I have actually given it as a tea for people who are going through alcohol withdrawal, along with things, to support liver function and things like that. And my limited experience, because I can't say I've treated that many people going through acute alcohol withdrawal, it does seem to help.
Right. And what form do you give it in? I have it in my clinic. It's very old right now. Probably need to throw it out, but this is a powder.
Well,
how do you dispense it?
it's hard to get really good Reponticum. All right. And again, if you get it out of like, if you get it from a TCM supplier, it's probably not the right species. I have a number of students who are from Russia who over the years have kind of brought me back Reponticum, it kind of not quite legally because they didn't declare it. They just sort of bagged it up and stuck it in their suitcase and managed to get it back to me. And so what I've done, because my supply has been very limited, you know, the funny thing is here I have an herb company, and I started the herb company because I couldn't get good tinctures for my patients. But the herb company, you know, dealing with all the regulations and all the stuff that you have to deal with today, it's pretty expensive to make product. So there's certain products they don't make anymore because it's just not commercially viable. You know, you can't make stuff that you lose money on. And so I'm back to actually making tinctures for my own patients again, just a small number of things, but things I can't get anywhere else, like evening primrose herb, not the seed oil, phenomenal herb that nobody knows anything about. It's like a really common weed. So that's one that I've made my own tincture of, because I don't think I think the powder probably has a shelf life maximum if it's stored in, you know, good conditions, maybe 3 or 4, maybe at a stretch 5 years, but you know, that's kind of pushing it. And so the tincture, you know, I think just has a longer shelf life. And it's easier to get because it doesn't taste great. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of bitter, kind of astringent.
So I hear that you only have a limited supply. Does your company sell it?
No, no, because we have not been able to get a supply that is regular and meets our quality control. And that's, you know, that's another issue about herbs is quality control. We talked about a couple of herbs where there's more than one species, and a lot of herbalists seem to have this idea if something's related to something else, it must have the same activity. Oh my God.
I like to think that way.
Well, but and sometimes it's true, like euphrasia, eyebright. I have tried 3 or 4 species of eyebright, they all do exactly the same thing. On the other hand, like viburnums, you have Viburnum prunifolium, Viburnum opulus, both are, you know, crampbark and black haw. They work the same, although I actually think black haw is slightly better, but they work fine. But then you take something like Viburnum casseloides or, you know, some of the other viburnums, they have no similar activity whatsoever.
Right.
They taste different, they smell different. And so for me, if you have an herb and it's a related species and it smells and tastes the same, that's a fairly good indicator that it probably has similar level of activity. I mean, it could be better, stronger, weaker, but that gives you some organoleptic sense that it has similar activity. But if you have something that is in the same genus, but it smells different, it tastes different.
Yeah. Like
for instance, basil and holy basil. They smell very different. They taste very different, and their activity is different. I would categorize holy basil as a probable adaptogen. Up until about 3 years ago, I would have said it was a possible adaptogen, but there's some animal research came out showing it was actually affecting the HPA axis and SAS at the same time. And there's an herb that you would think, well, here's this leafy herb, you know, most of your tonic herbs or roots and things like that, but there's some actually decent evidence, and I'm waiting for more human evidence to back it up, but there's a real difference between common garden basil or even Thai basil and holy basil. Exactly. And I would also point out that much of what's in the American marketplace as holy basil is not holy basil.
It's junk.
It's African basil, which also does not have the same activity as holy basil.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Tulsi, holy basil, is more in the adaptogen camp. My experience, I actually have experienced it myself.
Yeah,
where it seems to brighten things up a little bit when I drink it. You have to take sufficient dose of it. You know, don't just use a teaspoon of leaves to a cup of water, but maybe a tablespoon of leaves.
Yeah.
But you should be able to really feel, which is to me important with herbs. You should really be able to feel the benefit of holy basil.
Let people know that, you know, we can put up a slide, but my company, Herbalist and Alchemist, it's herbalist-alchemist.com. Please go and check it out. And then my 2-year herb studies program is herbalstudies.net. And, you know,
that's to all my students, by the way. David's course is fantastic. So I know many of you are taking other courses. Don't fool around with any other course. Just if you're going to take another course, take it from David.
Thank you, Michael. And I return the compliment, because your program is phenomenal. You know, depending on somebody's view, I think our courses complement each other really well, because we both have a similar view. I'm sure I cover herbs in my class that you don't cover. You cover herbs that I don't cover. We each have our unique views based on not years, decades and decades of experience. I know the other teachers in your program are exceptional. I've met most of them. The same thing is true with my program. And the idea, you know, for my program is to give people the foundation to be a clinical herbalist. You know, I'm not saying every one of my students becomes a clinical herbalist.
Right.
Half of my students are already medical professionals. They're MDs, NDs, DOs, nurse practitioners, nurses, dentists, veterinarians, acupuncturists, etc. The other half are people who just fell in love with herbs like I did, and either they've been, you know, self-studying for sometimes years, sometimes literally decades. And one of the things that's really surprised me over the last 15 years is I've started to get people who are like top name clinical herbalists, people who are our colleagues who I have incredible respect for, taking my program. And I'm like, you know, why are you taking the program? And because one of the things I guess they have found of is use is that we focus on materia medica. I think probably do a deeper dive into materia medica, meaning the materials of medicine, and we cover TCM materia medica, North American, you know, Ayurveda, etc. We cover over 300 plants in exquisite detail. And
Right.
as some people think, you know, who are already experienced herbalists think it's worth it, because I honestly, I don't know how anybody can be a clinician or an educator for that matter and not know that it's essential to keep learning.
And so I tell my students, you know, if you really, herbalism is sort of like a religion in a way, especially being a clinical herbalist, in the sense that they might count their beads and say their mantras. We have to look at the materia medica all the time, and just go over and over and over. You're
Right.
never going to know it. You'll never know it.
You'll never certainly know it all. Certain things stick into your memory. In fact, in the second half of my tier program, I teach a technique that I learned from one of my early teachers, William Lasassier, who I can, you know, credit as being one of the people who helped create the herbal renaissance that you and I are.
Yeah,
also,
I knew William well.
Yeah, I knew William well, and he created this technique called the triune system,
Right,
which is a I think of it as herbal Sudoku or 3D chess herbal medicine. It's like you're trying to keep all these things in your head and put them together to create a formula. It's a template to create a formula literally for the whole person at one time. So it's an amazing process. But I always tell my students, I said, I don't care if you actually, once you're in practice, I don't care if you use the triune system or not. I use it sometimes I don't in my practice. I said, but what the cool thing is, in learning how to do it, it forces you to go back and look at your materia medica over and over and over and over again until you start actually internally start getting a sense, not just of some rote memorization, but you start getting a sense of what I call the personality of the plant. And so there are times when a patient comes in and sits down, and I don't even know where it comes from. We'll call it intuition, but whatever it is, I'm already picking things up. And all of a sudden I'll note that I'm writing down the name of an herb. And I'm not even sure why consciously.
Yeah.
And then we do our intake and do tongue diagnosis and pulse and all the other stuff. And when I'm done, 95 times out of 100, I know exactly why that herb was written down, because that personality and the constitution of that person matches that herb. And I know that that's one of the herbs that I want to use in their formula. Or sometimes it's what the eclectics call a symptom picture, you know, or a specific indication, meaning they say something and it's just like this, you know, little bell goes off and you hear this little short sentence describing something's going on with them and you go, oh, I know I want to use that herb. And so I just love the fact that, you know, the more you study them, I would think of it more instead of a religion, I'll call it a spiritual practice. But instead, and you're talking about something, the last
Yeah,
time,
spiritual practice, not a
yeah,
religion.
you
I'm
know when
against religion.
the last time I was studying Materia Medica was?
Probably last night.
No, this morning.
This morning. That's I'm going to end on that note. All students who are watching this. David Winston studied in Materia Medica this morning, and I was preparing for this talk, and I studied the Materia Medica as well. So let's get back and keep studying and keep helping people and enjoying the wonderful life that herbal medicine has given us, and the rewards that nature is available to us through plants. Thank you so much, David, for a great interview.
Well, thank you, Michael. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to doing this again.